I followed the deer tracks for 2 hours, watching them press deeper into the soft earth as the trail wound through sections of forest I'd never explored before. The prints were clean and fresh, a decent-sized doe, probably the one I'd spotted near the creek that morning. My boots found quiet spots between the fallen branches while I kept my rifle ready, though I hadn't seen the actual deer since losing sight of her behind a cluster of massive pines. The trees here grew thick and tall, their canopy blocking out most of the afternoon sun. I had to step carefully around fallen logs and navigate through patches of undergrowth that grabbed at my cargo pants. The air felt heavier somehow, more humid than it should be for October. I wiped sweat from my forehead and checked my compass, still heading northeast, which meant I could find my way back to the cabin without any trouble. Then the tracks just stopped. I crouched down and studied the ground, running my fingers over the last clear hoofprint. The impression was perfect, showing the deer had been moving at a normal walking pace. But 3 feet ahead, nothing. No disturbed leaves, no broken twigs, no sign the animal had changed direction or jumped sideways. The tracks ended like someone had erased them. I stood up and looked around, trying to figure out what I was missing. Deer don't just vanish. Maybe she'd stepped onto harder ground, or maybe I'd lost the trail in the thick carpet of pine needles. I walked in a slow circle, searching for any sign of where she might have gone. That's when I noticed the quiet, complete, total silence. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, no buzz of insects. Even the wind had stopped moving through the branches above me. I'd been hunting these woods since I was 12, and I'd never experienced anything like this. There's always some kind of sound in a healthy forest. I took a few more steps forward and found myself at the edge of a small clearing I hadn't seen from behind the trees. The space was maybe 30 feet across, perfectly circular, with short grass that looked like it had been trimmed. No fallen branches, no dead leaves, no undergrowth. Just clean, even ground that seemed wrong compared to the wild tangle of forest surrounding it. In the exact center sat 7 stones arranged in a perfect circle. Each stone was about the size of my fist, smooth and rounded like river rocks. But they weren't the gray or brown you'd expect. They had no color at all, like someone had drained every bit of pigment from them. They sat evenly spaced, forming a circle maybe 6 feet across. The precision bothered me. Nature doesn't work in perfect geometric patterns. I walked closer, my boots making soft sounds on the strange grass. The stones looked old, weathered by years of rain and snow, but they were completely clean. Everything else in this forest was covered with moss or lichen, or at least a layer of dirt. These rocks looked like they'd been scrubbed yesterday. A chill ran down my arms as I approached the formation. The temperature had definitely dropped, which made no sense since the clearing should be warmer without the tree cover. I pulled my flannel shirt tighter and told myself I was being ridiculous. Stones were stones. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe other hunters had arranged them as some kind of marker, or maybe they'd been left by kids playing in the woods. I pulled out my phone to take a picture. Dad would get a kick out of seeing this weird formation. I held up the camera and tried to focus on the stones, but the image kept blurring. I tapped the screen and tried again. The phone seemed to struggle, hunting for focus like it couldn't decide what it was looking at. Finally, I got a decent shot, though the stones looked oddly flat in the image, like the camera couldn't capture their actual depth. The silence pressed against my ears. I'd been standing in the clearing for maybe 5 minutes, and the quiet was starting to feel heavy, almost solid. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I had maybe an hour of good light left, and the hike back to the cabin would take at least 40 minutes. I took one more look at the stone circle, trying to memorize the exact arrangement. 7 stones, perfectly spaced, sitting on ground that looked like it had never seen a weed. The whole thing felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. Not dangerous exactly, just off. I turned and headed back into the trees, following my own boot prints in the soft earth. The normal forest sounds gradually returned as I put distance between myself and the clearing, a woodpecker hammering somewhere above me, the rustle of a squirrel in the branches, the distant call of a crow. By the time I'd walked 100 yards, the woods felt normal again, but I kept looking back over my shoulder, not because I heard anything or saw movement, just because something in my brain kept insisting I was being watched. Every time I turned around, though, I saw nothing but trees and shadows and the path I'd already walked. The feeling followed me all the way back to the cabin. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photo I'd taken earlier. "Dad, check this out. Found something weird in the woods today." Maverick looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, his weathered hands still working the cleaning rod through the barrel. "What kind of weird?" I handed him the phone. "Some kind of stone circle. Never seen anything like it." The cleaning rod clattered to the floor. My father's face went completely white as he stared at the screen. His hand started shaking so badly I thought he might drop my phone. He brought it closer to his face, squinting at the image like he was trying to make sure he wasn't seeing things. "Mija, where exactly did you find this?" The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Gone was the relaxed tone we'd had all evening. This was the voice he used when something was seriously wrong. "About 2 hours northeast of here. I was tracking that doe, and..." "Show me." He thrust the phone back at me. "On the map. Show me exactly where." I opened the GPS app and found the location I'd marked. Maverick studied the coordinates, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. Then he started pacing across the small cabin, muttering rapid Spanish under his breath. I caught a few words, "Dios mío" and "no puede ser," but he was talking too fast for me to follow. "Dad, what's wrong? They're just rocks." He stopped pacing and looked at me like I'd said something incredibly stupid. "Just rocks? Crystal, these are not just rocks. These are barriers. Old barriers." "Barriers for what?" Maverick sat down heavily on his bunk, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. He rubbed his face with both hands before speaking. "My grandfather told me stories about these circles. The old people, the indigenous tribes who lived in these mountains before anyone else, they knew things. They understood that some parts of the forest hold darkness, evil spirits that feed on the living." I felt my eyebrows go up. "Evil spirits. Don't use that tone with me." His voice carried a sharpness I rarely heard. "You think because you went to college, because you have degrees, that makes you smarter than generations of people who survived in these woods? I think it means I understand the difference between folklore and reality." Maverick stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening forest. "The circles contain them. Keep them trapped in one place where they can't hurt anyone. But if the stones are moved, if the pattern is broken..." He didn't finish the sentence, but his shoulders tensed like he was expecting something to come crashing through the door. I looked at the photo again, 7 perfectly arranged stones in a clearing that felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain, but that didn't mean anything supernatural was going on. "Dad, come on, you're talking about spirits and evil entities, like they're real things. There has to be a logical explanation for why someone arranged those rocks." "Someone?" He turned back to me, his dark eyes intense. "You think people did this? Who else? Maybe other hunters use it as a landmark. Maybe kids were playing around out there." Maverick shook his head slowly. "Those circles are older than this country, Mija. Older than the towns, older than the roads. The stones were placed by people who understood what lives in the deep forest." I set my phone down and picked up my rifle, running the cleaning cloth along the barrel. The familiar motion helped me think clearly. "Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say indigenous people put those rocks there hundreds of years ago. That still doesn't mean they were trying to contain supernatural entities. Maybe it was ceremonial, or maybe they marked hunting grounds, or they marked prisons." His voice was flat, final. "Prisons for things called shigelas, The word sent an unexpected chill through me, but I pushed the feeling away. Shigelas, spirits of women who died violent deaths, murder, betrayal, abandonment. Their pain and rage keeps them tied to this world, but twisted, hungry. They appear beautiful at first, crying and helpless, begging for help. But once a man gets close enough, Maverick made a slashing motion across his throat. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not a mean laugh, just the kind that bubbles up when someone tells you something so ridiculous you can't process it seriously. Dad, listen to yourself. You're talking about vengeful ghosts that seduce men to death. That's not folklore. That's a horror movie. His expression hardened. My grandfather saw one. When he was young, before he learned to respect the barriers, it nearly killed him. Your grandfather told you a scary story to keep you from wandering too far into the woods. Parents have been doing that forever. This wasn't a story. Maverick's voice rose. He showed me the scars on his chest where her claws. Claws from what? A bear? A mountain lion? There are actual dangerous animals in these forests, Dad. Real predators that can hurt people. You don't need to invent supernatural ones. We stared at each other across the small cabin. I could see the frustration building in his face, the same look he got when he tried to explain something important and felt like I wasn't listening. But I was listening. I just wasn't buying it. Crystal, promise me something. He sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Promise me you won't go back to that clearing. Don't touch those stones. Don't disturb anything. Dad, promise me. The intensity in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't just concern or superstition. This was fear, real, bone-deep fear that made his hands shake and his voice crack. But promising would mean accepting that his explanation made sense. It would mean agreeing that supernatural entities were real, that ancient stone circles actually contained evil spirits, that the rational worldview I'd built my entire adult life around was somehow incomplete. I promise, I'll be careful, I said finally. Maverick's shoulders sagged. That's not what I asked. It's what I can give you. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected this answer, but hoped for better. The old knowledge, the things my grandfather taught me. You think it's all nonsense. I think it's culture and tradition and stories that helped people make sense of a world they didn't understand yet. That doesn't make it nonsense. It just makes it different from how we understand things now. And if you're wrong, I looked at the photo one more time. 7 stones in a perfect circle sitting in a clearing that felt wrong for reasons I couldn't name. But feelings weren't facts. Intuition wasn't evidence. Then I'll deal with whatever's actually there when I find it. Maverick picked up his cleaning rod and went back to working on his rifle. The conversation was over, but the tension in his shoulders told me he wasn't satisfied. He'd tried to pass on some piece of family wisdom, and I'd rejected it like I always did when his beliefs bumped up against my education. I finished cleaning my own rifle in silence, already planning tomorrow's hike back to the clearing, not because I wanted to prove him wrong, exactly. More because I needed to prove to myself that the world still made sense in the ways I understood it. 7 stones arranged in a circle. There had to be a logical explanation, and I was going to find it. I woke up before dawn and lay in my bunk listening to Dad move around the cabin, getting his gear together for the trap line, coffee brewing, boots on the wooden floor, the soft clink of metal tools going into his pack. Normal morning sounds that should have been comforting but somehow weren't. The conversation from last night kept replaying in my head, the way his hands had shaken when he saw that photo, the fear in his voice when he talked about barriers and evil spirits. I'd seen my father handle injured animals, navigate whiteout blizzards, even face down an aggressive black bear without breaking a sweat. but 7 stones in a clearing had turned him into someone I barely recognized. "Heading out to check the snares," he called softly, probably thinking I was still asleep. Back by noon, I waited until I heard his footsteps fade into the forest before getting up. The cabin felt different with him gone, quieter, but also somehow less protected, which was ridiculous. Protected from what? Rocks arranged in a circle. I made coffee and sat at the small table, staring at the photo on my phone. In the morning light streaming through the cabin windows, the whole thing seemed even more absurd. My father, a man who taught me to track deer by the depth of their hoof prints and identify edible plants by the shape of their leaves, actually believed that indigenous people had built supernatural prisons in the forest, that spirits of murdered women were somehow contained by geometric stone arrangements. The rational part of my brain knew what was really happening here. Dad was getting older, more isolated, spending too much time alone in these woods with nothing but family stories for company. The line between folklore and reality was blurring for him. It happened to a lot of people his age, especially when they'd grown up hearing these tales from grandparents who'd lived in a very different world. But that didn't explain the feeling I'd had in the clearing, the wrongness of it, the way my phone had struggled to focus on the stones, or how the temperature had dropped for no reason I could identify. I finished my coffee and checked my gear. If I was going to prove to myself that the world still made sense, I needed to go back there. Not to prove Dad wrong exactly, but to prove myself right. To demonstrate that 7 rocks in a circle were just 7 rocks in a circle, no matter how precisely arranged or how old they might be. The hike took me an hour and 40 minutes this time, since I knew exactly where I was going. I followed my own boot prints from yesterday, retracing the path through the thick forest until I reached the edge of that perfectly circular clearing. Everything was exactly as I left it. The 7 stones sat in their precise formation, evenly spaced, completely colorless in the morning sunlight. The grass around them looked freshly trimmed, no fallen leaves, no debris, no sign that anything had disturbed this place in decades, or maybe centuries. I stood at the tree line for a few minutes, just watching, listening. The same unnatural quiet hung over the clearing, though I could hear normal forest sounds from the woods behind me. A woodpecker hammering somewhere to my left, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, but the clearing itself remained silent. This was stupid. I was a grown woman with a degree in wildlife biology, standing at the edge of a patch of grass like it might bite me, because my father had told me ghost stories. I walked into the clearing. The temperature dropped immediately, just like yesterday, but temperature fluctuations happened all the time in forests. Microclimates created by elevation changes, tree cover, moisture levels. There were a dozen scientific explanations for why this spot might be cooler than the surrounding area. I approached the stone circle and crouched down next to the largest rock. It was smooth and rounded, about the size of a softball, completely devoid of color like someone had bleached it. When I touched the surface, it felt normal. Cool stone, slightly rough texture, nothing unusual. Standing up, I looked around the clearing one more time. Birds chirped in the distance. A squirrel chattered somewhere behind me. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating patches of light and shadow on the strange, perfect grass. Nothing supernatural was happening. Nothing at all. I drew back my foot and kicked the largest stone as hard as I could. It rolled about 6 feet, coming to rest against the base of a pine tree with a solid thunk. The remaining 6 stones sat in their positions, but the perfect circle was broken now. A gap where the 7th stone should be. I waited. Nothing happened. No dramatic supernatural events, no scary signs or ominous warnings. Just a stone circle that was now missing a stone. The forest sounds seemed to get a little louder, like the area was waking up. More birds calling to each other. The whisper of wind through branches overhead. Even the oppressive quiet that had bothered me so much began to lift. I felt vindicated and slightly embarrassed. Here I'd been, getting spooked by perfectly normal geological formations because my father had filled my head with old stories. The stones were just stones. The clearing was just a clearing. Whatever indigenous people had arranged this formation, they'd done it for practical reasons that had nothing to do with containing evil spirits. I walked over and picked up the stone I'd kicked, then carried it back toward the circle. But instead of putting it back in its original position, I set it down randomly, breaking the geometric pattern even further. Then I moved 2 more stones, arranging them in a rough line instead of a circle. Still nothing happened. Feeling bolder, I gathered 3 of the remaining stones and stacked them into a small pile. The precise formation that had seemed so ominous yesterday now looked like what it probably was, rocks that someone had arranged for reasons lost to time. Maybe they'd marked a meeting place or a ceremonial site, or just been the project of bored children playing in the woods. I spent another 10 minutes rearranging the stones into different patterns, a straight line, a triangle, random scattered positions. Each time I waited for some kind of supernatural response that never came. The sun climbed higher, warming the clearing and making the whole place feel less mysterious. By the time I was ready to leave, the area seemed almost normal, still quiet, still oddly perfect in its circular shape, but no longer threatening. I'd proven my point. Dad's barriers were just rocks, and his evil spirits were just stories. The hike back started out feeling triumphant. I'd faced down my own superstitious fears and demonstrated that rational thinking could explain away supernatural nonsense. The forest felt normal around me, birds singing, insects buzzing, the familiar sounds of a healthy ecosystem. But about 20 minutes into the walk, I started hearing something else. Crying. Soft, feminine sobbing that seemed to drift through the trees from no direction I could identify. At first, I thought it might be wind moving through the branches in an unusual way, or maybe a bird call I didn't recognize. Some species could make surprisingly human-like sounds. I stopped walking and listened carefully. The crying continued, faint but distinct. Definitely not wind. Too rhythmic and emotional to be an animal. I started walking again, and the sobbing seemed to follow me. Not getting closer or farther away, just maintaining the same distance and volume, regardless of my pace. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved with me. My rational brain offered explanations. Sound could carry strangely in forests, bouncing off trees and rocks in ways that made it seem like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Maybe there was a hiker somewhere in the distance, someone who'd gotten lost or injured. Maybe it was echoing from a road or a campground I couldn't see, but the crying sounded so sad, so desperate, like someone was experiencing the kind of grief that comes from losing everything that matters. I picked up my pace, suddenly wanting to get back to the cabin and away from whatever was making that sound. The sobbing stayed with me for another 10 minutes before gradually fading away, becoming softer and more distant until I couldn't hear it anymore. By the time I reached the cabin, the forest was completely quiet again. Normal quiet, not the oppressive silence of the clearing, just the regular absence of sound that happens in deep woods during the middle of the day. I sat on the front steps and pulled out my water bottle, trying to process what I'd experienced. The crying had probably been my imagination, influenced by Dad's stories about murdered women and vengeful spirits. When you're primed to expect supernatural encounters, your brain starts interpreting normal sounds in supernatural ways. That had to be it, because the alternative, that I'd actually heard something otherworldly in those woods, would mean my father had been right about things I wasn't ready to accept. I checked my watch. Almost noon. Dad would be back soon, and I could tell him about my little experiment with the stones, how I'd proven that his ancient barriers were harmless, that nothing dramatic had happened when I'd disturbed them, though maybe I wouldn't mention the crying. No point in feeding his superstitions with stories about mysterious sounds in the forest. I finished my water and went inside to start lunch, pushing the memory of that sad, distant sobbing to the back of my mind where it belonged. The crying started again at 2:17 a.m. I'd been lying awake waiting for it, staring at the ceiling and listening to Dad's steady breathing from the next bunk. 3 nights in a row now, 3 nights of that heartbroken sobbing drifting around our cabin like it was looking for something. Tonight it sounded different, closer, more desperate. I rolled over and pressed my face against the small window next to my bed. The glass was cold against my cheek, fogged with condensation from the temperature difference between inside and outside. I wiped it clear with my sleeve and peered into the darkness. Nothing but black forest and the faint outline of trees against the starlit sky. But the crying was definitely out there, moving from left to right like someone was walking a slow circle around the building. The sound made my chest tight. It wasn't the kind of crying you do when you stub your toe or get frustrated. This was grief. Raw, devastating loss that seemed to pour out of whoever was making it, like they'd lost everything that mattered and couldn't figure out how to keep breathing. I slipped out of my bunk and padded across the cold wooden floor to Dad's side of the cabin. He was sleeping peacefully, one arm thrown over his eyes, completely undisturbed by the wailing outside. "Dad," I shook his shoulder gently. "Dad, wake up." He stirred and mumbled something in Spanish before opening his eyes. "What's wrong, mija? Do you hear that? The crying?" Maverick sat up and listened for a long moment. The sobbing continued its circuit around the cabin, now accompanied by what sounded like bare feet shuffling through the fallen leaves and underbrush. "I don't hear anything unusual," he said finally. "Just normal forest sounds." "Normal?" I stared at him. "Dad, someone is walking around our cabin crying their eyes out. How is that normal?" He rubbed his face with both hands, the way he did when he was trying to be patient with me. "Crystal, you've been having bad dreams ever since we talked about the stone circle. Your mind is playing tricks on you." The crying got louder, more frantic. Now I could make out individual gasps and hiccups between the sobs, like someone was hyperventilating from emotional overload. "Listen," I whispered urgently. "Just listen." Dad tilted his head and concentrated. The weeping continued for another 30 seconds before gradually fading toward the back of the cabin. "I hear wind in the trees," he said gently. "Maybe an owl in the distance. Nothing else." I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him. The crying was so clear, so obviously human, that I couldn't understand how he was missing it, unless he was lying to me, unless he knew exactly what was making that sound and didn't want to admit it. "Go back to sleep," he said, lying down and pulling his blanket up to his chin. "Tomorrow, we'll head home, and you'll feel better once you're away from these woods." But I couldn't sleep. Not with that broken-hearted wailing circling our cabin like a predator looking for a way in. I sat on the edge of my bunk with my knees pulled up to my chest, tracking the sound as it moved from window to window. The crying went on until dawn, when it finally faded away with the first hint of sunlight filtering through the trees. The next evening, it started again at sunset. This time, I didn't bother trying to wake Dad. I just lay in my bunk and listened as the sobbing began its nightly patrol around our cabin. But tonight it was different, louder, more insistent, like whatever was making the sound had gotten braver. The weeping seemed to pause at each window, lingering there for minutes at a time before moving on to the next one. When it stopped outside my window, I could hear individual words mixed in with the crying, broken Spanish phrases I couldn't quite make out, and what sounded like someone calling for help. I pressed my ear against the wall and held my breath, trying to understand what the voice was saying, but the words were too distorted by tears and distance for me to catch more than fragments. "Por favor," came through clearly once. "Please. Ayúdame," another time. "Help me." My hands started shaking. Someone was out there in the dark, lost and terrified and begging for assistance. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go outside and help them, but Dad's warnings about evil spirits and supernatural dangers kept me frozen in place. What if this was exactly what he'd been talking about? What if the thing I'd released by moving those stones was now circling our cabin, trying to lure me outside? But what if it wasn't? What if some poor hiker had gotten lost in the woods and was genuinely crying for help? What if I was sitting here listening to a real person suffer because I was too scared of ghost stories to do anything? The crying continued until morning, and I didn't sleep at all. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The sobbing started earlier this time, right after the sun disappeared behind the mountains. But now it sounded like the person was right outside our walls, close enough that I should be able to see them through the windows. The emotional pain in that voice was so intense it made my own chest ache in sympathy. I got up and checked every window, pressing my face against the glass and straining to see into the darkness. Nothing, just black forest and the pale shapes of tree trunks in the moonlight. But the crying was right there, right outside, like someone was standing 3 feet away, weeping with their whole body. "Dad," I whispered, but he was sleeping soundly again, completely unaffected by the sounds that were driving me crazy. The voice started calling out words I could understand. "Please, help me. I'm so cold. I'm so alone. Please don't leave me out here." That did it. I couldn't sit inside listening to someone beg for help while I did nothing. Ghost story or not, supernatural entity or not, I had to know what was really out there. I pulled on my boots and grabbed Dad's shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. The weight of it felt reassuring in my hands. 12 gauge, loaded with buckshot, enough to stop anything that might actually threaten me. I also took the heavy-duty flashlight from the kitchen counter, the kind that could light up half an acre. The crying was coming from the north side of the cabin now, toward the muddy area where the small creek ran close to our clearing. I could hear footsteps in the wet ground, squelching sounds like someone walking through thick mud. I unlocked the front door as quietly as possible and stepped into the cool night air. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since sunset, and my breath came out in small puffs of vapor. The forest around our cabin was completely silent, except for the heartbroken sobbing that seemed to be coming from just beyond the tree line. I raised the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness like a sword, illuminating the muddy ground near the creek in harsh white light. And there, maybe 20 feet away, was exactly what I'd been hearing for 3 nights. A young woman lying naked in the mud. Her body shook with violent sobs as she curled into a fetal position, long dark hair covering most of her face. She looked like she was in her early 20s, small and delicate, covered in dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her skin was pale in the flashlight beam, almost translucent, and she was shivering uncontrollably. My first thought was that someone had been attacked, assaulted, and left for dead in the woods. My second thought was that I needed to help her immediately. "Hey," I called out, softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" The sobbing stopped instantly. Complete silence fell over the forest like someone had thrown a switch. No insects buzzing, no wind in the trees. Even the distant sound of the creek seemed to disappear. The woman slowly raised her head and looked directly at me. Her smile revealed teeth that were black and rotting in a face that was partially decomposed. Gray, mottled skin hung in patches from her skull, and where her eyes should have been were hollow, black sockets that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. The grin stretched wider than any human face could manage, extending beyond the boundaries of her cheeks until it looked like her head might split in half. I screamed and stumbled backward, nearly dropping the shotgun. The thing began to rise from the mud with movements that bent in ways joints shouldn't bend. Her spine curved backward at an impossible angle as she stood, and her arms twisted around themselves like they had extra bones. I turned and ran toward the cabin, hearing inhuman laughter behind me that echoed through the trees like breaking glass. Something was chasing me through the darkness. I could hear it moving through the underbrush with wet, slapping sounds that didn't match human footsteps. I slammed through the front door and immediately turned every lock we had, then grabbed the deadbolt and threw it into place. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the mechanisms. "Dad!" I screamed. "Dad, wake up!" But when I turned around, his bunk was empty. The thing's grin stretched impossibly wide as it unfolded from the mud like some broken marionette. I turned and sprinted toward the cabin, my boots slipping on wet leaves as that horrible laughter echoed behind me. Something was crashing through the underbrush, making wet slapping sounds that definitely weren't footsteps. I hit the front door so hard it bounced off the wall. My hands shook as I threw the deadbolt and turned every lock we had, then grabbed the shotgun and checked that it was loaded. Buckshot. Enough to stop anything real. The forest had gone completely silent again. I pressed my back against the door and tried to catch my breath. My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear anything else. The flashlight beam wavered as I swept it across the cabin's interior, checking corners and shadows. Dad's bunk was still empty. He must have gotten up to use the outhouse while I was outside. Any second now, he'd come walking back, probably wondering why I was standing here with his shotgun like I was about to fight off an invasion. A soft knock came from the door behind me. 3 gentle taps, like someone being polite. "Crystal?" The voice was sweet and young, muffled by the wooden door. "Crystal, please help me. I'm so scared." I stepped away from the door, raising the shotgun. "Where's my father?" "I don't know about any father. Please, I'm hurt. I need help." The voice sounded completely normal now. Human. A young woman who was frightened and alone in the dark woods. But I'd seen what was really out there. The rotting teeth and hollow eye sockets. The way her body had moved like it was held together with wire. "Go away," I said. "Please don't leave me out here. Something's wrong with me. I can't remember how I got here." The knocking came again, harder this time. The door shook in its frame. I said go away. The pounding started in earnest then. Not knocking anymore, but hammering blows that made the entire cabin shake. The deadbolt held, but I could see the door frame starting to flex with each impact. Boom, boom, boom. Whatever was hitting the door had strength that no human possessed. The sound echoed through the small cabin like gunshots, and I could hear the wooden frame beginning to splinter. Then it stopped. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds before a different sound started. Soft crying again, but now it was coming from the back of the cabin, from the window next to Dad's bunk. I moved carefully across the floor, keeping the shotgun ready. The crying got louder as I approached the window, heartbroken sobs that made my chest ache despite everything I'd just seen. "Please," came the voice through the glass. "I just want to go home. I can't find my way home." I looked out the window but saw only darkness. The crying seemed to be coming from right outside, but there was nothing visible in the small patch of moonlight. "Where's my father?" I called out. The sobbing stopped instantly. "What father?" The voice was different now, sharper. "There's no one else here, just you and me." A shadow moved past the window, too quick for me to track. Then the pounding started again, this time on the back wall. The whole cabin shook with each blow, and I heard something crack in the wooden siding. I ran to the front window and peered out toward the outhouse. The The small wooden structure sat about 50 yards away, its door hanging open. Empty. Where was Dad? He should have been back by now. He should have heard the noise and come running. The pounding moved to the side wall, then to the front door again. It was circling the cabin, hitting different spots like it was testing for weak points. Each impact sent vibrations through the floor and made the windows rattle in their frames. "Let me in, Crystal." The voice was right outside the front door now, sweet and pleading. "I'm so cold. I'm so alone." "No. I know you want to help me. You're a good person. You came outside when you heard me crying." The thing was right. I had wanted to help. Every instinct I possessed had screamed at me to go to that sobbing woman and offer assistance. Even now, hearing the pain in that voice, part of me wanted to unlock the door. "Your father told you stories about me, didn't he?" The voice took on a mocking tone. Old superstitions, primitive beliefs. My blood went cold. "How do you know about that?" Laughter drifted through the door. Not the inhuman shrieking from before, but normal, feminine laughter that somehow sounded worse. "I know lots of things, Crystal. I know you moved my stones. I know you don't believe in monsters." The pounding resumed, harder than before. The door frame was definitely starting to give way now. I could see gaps appearing around the edges where the wood was pulling apart. I backed toward the center of the cabin, shotgun raised. If that thing broke through, I'd have maybe one good shot before it reached me. "I know you're wondering where your father is," the voice continued between impacts. "Would you like to see him? Shut up. He's right here with me. We've been having such interesting conversations." Boom, boom, boom. The deadbolt was holding, but the frame around it was cracking. A few more hits, and the whole thing would give way. Then the pounding stopped again. Footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. They paused at each window, and I could feel something watching me from outside. The sensation was so strong it made my skin crawl. "Crystal." The voice was at the side window now, barely above a whisper. "Come look." I didn't move. "Come see what I have for you." The footsteps continued their circuit. Back window, other side window, front door again. "I can wait all night," the voice said. "I'm very patient. I've had lots of practice." The attacks continued for hours, sometimes pounding that shook the whole cabin, sometimes gentle knocking that was somehow worse. The voice kept changing too. Young woman, old woman, child, something that didn't sound human at all. It told me stories about the other people who'd found the stone's circle over the years. Hunters and hikers who'd moved the rocks out of curiosity or accident. What had happened to them afterward. The details were specific enough to make me sick. "Your father knew," it whispered during one of the quiet periods. "He tried to warn you, but you were too smart to listen." I stayed in the center of the cabin with the shotgun ready, tracking the sounds as they moved around the building. My arms ached from holding the weapon, but I didn't dare put it down. Around 3 a.m., the thing started singing. Soft lullabies in Spanish that I recognized from childhood. Songs my grandmother had sung to me when I was small. The voice was perfect, exactly like hers, and for a moment I almost believed she was out there. But my grandmother had been dead for 10 years. "Duérmete mi niña," the voice sang sweetly. "Duérmete mi amor." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the singing continued. It seemed to come from inside my head now, impossible to block out. The attacks went on until the first hint of dawn appeared through the windows. As soon as the sky began to lighten, everything stopped. The singing cut off mid-note. The footsteps disappeared. Even the oppressive feeling of being watched lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. I waited another hour before I dared to move from my position in the center of the cabin. When I finally looked out the front window, the forest appeared completely normal. Birds were starting to sing in the trees. A squirrel ran across the clearing, stopping to dig in the fallen leaves. But Dad still wasn't back. I unlocked the front door and stepped outside, shotgun ready. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the normal scents of pine and damp earth. No trace of the decay smell I'd noticed near that thing in the mud. The outhouse door still hung open. I approached it carefully and looked inside. Empty, but there were dark stains on the wooden floor that hadn't been there yesterday. I called Dad's name and got no response except the echo of my own voice bouncing off the trees. He was gone, and I had a terrible feeling I knew what had happened to him. The thing in the forest had my father, and it was just getting started. I jerked awake to find Dad sitting on the edge of his bunk, fully dressed and lacing up his boots. "Dad?" My voice came out hoarse and shaky. "Where were you? I looked everywhere." "I heard the gunshot," he said without looking up. "Been tracking whatever you were shooting at for the last 2 hours." "Gunshot?" I sat up, confused. "I didn't fire the gun." He paused, one boot half tied. "Crystal, you discharged the shotgun around midnight. Woke up half the mountain." I stared at him. I had no memory of pulling the trigger. The weapon was still in my hands, and when I checked the chamber, one shell was missing. "I don't remember shooting anything." Dad finished with his boots and turned to face me. In the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the windows, he looked older than I'd ever seen him. Deep lines creased his forehead, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from more than just lost sleep. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "All of it." So I did. The crying that had been going on for 3 nights. The thing in the mud that looked like a woman but wasn't. The way it had moved with joints bending wrong. The rotting teeth and hollow eye sockets. The hours of pounding on the cabin walls. Dad's face went completely white as I talked. His hands started shaking the same way they had when I'd shown him the photo of the stone circle. "Dios mío," he whispered when I finished. "It's free." "What's free?" "The shigella." He stood up and started gathering gear from around the cabin. Rope, a small toolkit, matches, and a leather pouch I'd never seen before. Spirits of women who died violent deaths. Murder, betrayal, abandonment. Their pain and rage keeps them tied to this world, but twisted, hungry. I wanted to argue with him, to offer rational explanations for what I'd experienced, but I couldn't get the image of that thing's impossible grin out of my head. "You said they go after men," I said. "Mostly, but they'll kill anyone who sets them free." Dad's voice was grim as he checked the contents of the leather pouch. "I should have told you more. Should have made you understand." "Told me what?" He looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding something. "I encountered this same shigella when I was about your age. Made the same mistake you did. Moved the stones because I thought I knew better than the old stories." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "It nearly killed me. Would have if my father hadn't found me in time." Dad pulled up his shirt, revealing 3 long scars across his chest that I'd never noticed before. They looked like claw marks. Took both of us working together to get the circle rebuilt and the thing contained again. He grabbed the shotgun from my hands and slung it over his shoulder. "We need to fix this now, while it's still daylight. These things are weaker when the sun's up." The hike to the clearing felt different in morning light. Normal forest sounds surrounded us. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant sound of running water. But Dad moved like we were walking into a war zone, constantly scanning the trees and stopping every few minutes to listen. "Stay close," he said. "Don't touch anything I don't tell you to touch. And whatever you do, don't listen to anything it says if it shows up." The clearing looked exactly like I'd left it. 7 stones scattered in random positions, the perfect circle completely destroyed. But now I could see what I'd missed in the darkness. The grass wasn't just unnaturally short and clean. It was dead, brown and brittle, like something had sucked all the life out of it. There, Dad pointed to a spot near the center. That's where the largest stone belongs. Help me move it back. We worked quickly, Dad directing me to the exact position of each rock. He seemed to remember the precise arrangement, measuring distances with his steps and adjusting angles until everything looked right. How do you know where they go? I asked as we rolled the fourth stone into place. My father made me memorize the pattern after what happened. Said if I was stupid enough to break it once, I better be smart enough to fix it if it happened again. As we positioned the sixth stone, I heard something that made my blood freeze, soft crying, distant but getting closer. It knows what we're doing, Dad said grimly. Hurry! We grabbed the last stone together, a smooth gray rock about the size of a basketball. It was heavier than it looked, and we had to coordinate our movements to get it into the exact center of the formation. The moment we set it down, the crying stopped. Complete silence fell over the clearing, the same oppressive quiet I'd experienced when I first found this place. But now it felt different, not empty but full of something being held back. Then the crying started again, but muffled this time, like it was coming from deep underground, trapped beneath layers of earth and stone. Did we do it right? I whispered. Dad was pulling items from the leather pouch, dried sage, small bones, what looked like pieces of colored glass. He arranged them in a specific pattern around the stone circle while muttering words in Spanish I didn't recognize. The stones are the main barrier, he said without stopping his work. This just reinforces it. Make sure the containment holds. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. I turned and saw her standing just inside the tree line. Not the rotting horror from last night, but a young woman who looked maybe 25. She was beautiful in a heartbreaking way. Long, dark hair, large brown eyes filled with tears, delicate features that made you want to protect her. She was also completely naked and covered in what looked like dried blood. Please, she called out in a voice that was pure anguish. Please don't leave me trapped here. I didn't do anything wrong. Dad grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. Don't look at her. Don't listen. But I couldn't help it. The woman's pain was so obvious, so genuine, that every instinct I had screamed at me to help her. I was murdered, she continued, taking a step closer to the circle. Killed by men who said they loved me. All I want is justice. All I want is peace. She's lying, Dad said urgently. That's what they do. They make you feel sorry for them. The woman's eyes locked onto mine. You understand, don't you? You know what it's like when people don't believe you, when they dismiss your pain. She was right. I did know what that felt like. The way Dad had brushed off my concerns about the crying. The way people had always treated my opinions like they mattered less because I was young, because I was a woman. Crystal. No. Dad's voice was sharp with warning. The woman smiled, and for just a second I saw something else underneath the beautiful facade. A flash of rotting teeth and hollow sockets before the illusion snapped back into place. The stones stay where they are, I said firmly, her expression twisted with rage before smoothing back into desperate pleading. You don't understand what you're doing. I'm not the monster here. I'm the victim. Dad finished his ritual and stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. It's done. The barrier will hold as long as the stones aren't moved again. The woman let out a shriek of fury that echoed through the trees like breaking glass. Birds exploded from the branches overhead, and something large crashed through the underbrush in the distance. Then she was gone, vanished like she'd never been there at all. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by normal forest sounds. The dead grass in the clearing was still brown and brittle, but the wrongness I'd felt in this place seemed contained now, held in check by 7 smooth stones arranged in a perfect circle. Will it stay trapped? I asked. Dad shouldered his pack and started walking toward the tree line. As long as nobody moves the stones again, and as long as people remember why they're there. I took one last look at the circle before following him. The stones sat exactly where they belonged, ancient and weathered and completely colorless. They looked like they'd been there forever. Maybe they had been. The crying got weaker each day. On the second morning after we rebuilt the circle, I woke to what sounded like distant whimpering instead of the desperate wails that had been keeping me up all night. Dad was already awake, sitting on his bunk and listening with his head tilted toward the window. "It's working," he said quietly. "She's being pulled back." "Back where?" "Whatever place holds creatures like that. The space between worlds, maybe. I don't pretend to understand it all." He stood and started making coffee. "My grandfather said the spirits get weaker when they're properly contained. Takes a few days for them to fade completely." By the third day, the whimpering had turned into something barely audible, soft hiccups that came and went like someone crying themselves to sleep. I found myself almost feeling sorry for the thing, which was probably exactly what it wanted. "Don't," Dad warned when he caught me listening too intently at the window. "That's how they get you. Even trapped, they're still dangerous if you let your guard down." The fourth morning brought complete silence. Not the oppressive, unnatural quiet I'd experienced in the clearing, but normal forest sounds. Birds chirping in the trees, squirrels chattering at each other, the distant buzz of insects going about their business. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from the entire area. "It's over," Dad said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. I tested his theory by hiking to the creek where I'd first seen the thing in the mud. The spot looked completely ordinary now, just wet earth and fallen leaves, no trace of the decay smell or unnatural coldness. A blue jay landed nearby and started pecking at something in the dirt, totally unbothered by the location. We spent the next few days actually hunting, something that felt weird after everything that had happened. I managed to get a decent 6-point buck about a mile south of the cabin, and Dad bagged 2 rabbits near the old logging road. Normal stuff, the kind of trip we'd been planning before I found those stones and screwed everything up. I stayed away from the clearing, though. Dad never suggested we check on it, and I never asked. Some things were better left alone. The forest felt like itself again, wild and alive, but not malevolent. I could walk through the trees without constantly looking over my shoulder or jumping at every sound. Whatever had been wrong with this place was contained now, held in check by 7 stones and my father's knowledge of things I was only beginning to understand. We packed up on Sunday morning, loading our gear into Dad's old pickup truck. I took one last look around the cabin, trying to memorize the details. The way morning light slanted through the windows, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, Dad humming quietly to himself as he secured the cooler in the truck bed. "You learned something important this week," he said as we drove down the mountain road. "Yeah, that I should listen to you more often." He laughed, but his expression stayed serious. "You learned that some knowledge gets passed down for good reasons, that just because something sounds impossible doesn't mean it's not true." I nodded, watching the trees blur past my window. "Will you teach me more? About the old stories and the protective rituals? If you want to learn, I'll teach you everything I know." The months that followed were different between us. Dad started sharing stories his grandfather had told him, not just about supernatural dangers, but about reading weather patterns and tracking animals and understanding the rhythms of the forest. I listened without arguing or offering scientific explanations for everything. Some knowledge didn't need to be dissected and analyzed. Some things just needed to be respected. Spring came early that year. Dad called me in March to say the snow was melting fast up at the cabin and maybe we should plan another trip soon. I was looking forward to it, to spending time with him in the woods, to learning more about the traditions I'd almost lost through my own stubbornness. The call came on a Tuesday morning in April. Dad had died in his sleep, the paramedics said. Heart attack. Quick and peaceful, no suffering. I drove to his house in a daze, handling arrangements and paperwork while trying to process that he was really gone. The funeral was small. Dad hadn't been one for making a lot of friends, but the people who came had stories about his kindness and his knowledge of the old ways. 3 weeks later, I needed to feel close to him again. The cabin seemed like the obvious place to go. We'd shared something important there, learned to understand each other in ways we never had before. I wanted to sit in that small space and remember his voice, maybe figure out how to carry on the knowledge he'd started teaching me. I drove up the familiar mountain road on a bright Saturday morning, windows down and music playing. The trees were green with new growth, and wildflowers dotted the meadows between stands of pine. Everything looked exactly like it should, until I reached the clearing where our cabin had stood. Nothing remained but a pile of blackened wood and twisted metal. The stone foundation was cracked and scattered, and ash covered everything in a gray layer that the spring rains hadn't washed away. The fire had been hot enough to melt the aluminum siding and turn the windows into puddles of glass. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the destruction. There were no power lines up here, no electrical systems that could have malfunctioned. Dad had been careful about the wood stove and the propane tanks. This shouldn't have happened, but as I looked at the ruins of the place where my father had taught me to respect things I couldn't understand, a cold certainty settled in my stomach. I knew exactly what had caused this fire. I stood in what used to be our cabin, ash crunching under my boots like broken bones. The smell hit me first, not just smoke and charred wood, but something underneath that made my stomach turn, something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in a grave. The metal frame of Dad's bunk had melted into twisted shapes that looked almost like reaching hands. Our coffee mugs were puddles of ceramic in what used to be the kitchen area. Even the stone foundation had cracked apart, huge chunks scattered around the clearing like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them. But there were no power lines up here, no electrical, anything that could spark. Dad had been religious about banking the wood stove properly, and the propane tanks were stored 50 feet away from the cabin. This fire shouldn't have been possible. I kicked through the debris anyway, looking for something that might explain what happened. Maybe lightning had struck during a storm. Maybe some idiot campers had left a fire burning nearby. Maybe anything except what my gut was already telling me. That's when I noticed the trees. The pines closest to the cabin weren't just burned. They were scorched in a pattern that made no sense. Blackened bark spiraled around the trunks like something had wrapped itself around them while on fire. The damage was worst on the north side, pointing toward the creek where I'd first seen that thing in the mud, pointing toward the stone circle. My hands started shaking as I followed the burn pattern through the trees. The scorched bark led away from the cabin ruins like a trail, getting lighter as it moved deeper into the forest. Whatever had caused this fire hadn't started at the cabin. It had started somewhere else and spread here. The hike to the clearing felt like walking through a nightmare. Every step took me closer to something I didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. The forest was too quiet again. Not the peaceful silence of a healthy woods, but the dead quiet that meant everything with sense had fled. I smelled the clearing before I saw it. That same rotten, sweet stench, but stronger now, concentrated, like something had been decomposing here for months instead of weeks. The stone circle was destroyed, not just scattered like I'd left it that first day, but completely demolished. The 7 smooth rocks had been smashed into fragments, some pieces no bigger than gravel. Deep gouges in the earth showed where something had clawed at the ground with inhuman strength. The grass wasn't just dead anymore, it was gone entirely, leaving behind black soil that looked burned from the inside out. I walked to the center of what used to be the circle, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The largest stone, the one Dad and I had placed so carefully in the exact center, was split clean in half. The break was too clean, too precise. like something had torn it apart with its bare hands. Burn marks radiated out from the circle in all directions, charring the nearby trees and leaving patches of ash where undergrowth used to grow. The damage was worst heading south toward our cabin, toward the place where my father had taught me to respect things I couldn't understand. I crouched down and touched one of the stone fragments. It was ice cold despite the warm afternoon sun, and my fingers came away covered in a gray residue that smelled like sulfur and decay. The wrongness of this place pressed against me from all sides, making it hard to breathe. Dad was gone. The protective rituals he'd performed were gone with him, and whatever we'd trapped in this circle had broken free. I stood up fast, suddenly desperate to get away from this place. But as I turned to leave, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Just a shadow flitting between the trees, too quick to track. When I looked directly at it, nothing was there. The smell got stronger. Rotten flowers and something else, wet earth, like a fresh grave. I started walking back toward my truck, trying not to run. The shadow kept pace with me, always just outside my direct vision. Sometimes on my left, sometimes on my right, sometimes behind me. Never close enough to see clearly, but always there. Soft laughter drifted through the trees. Not the broken glass shriek I remembered from that night at the cabin, but something worse. Satisfied laughter, happy laughter, the sound of something that had gotten exactly what it wanted. I broke into a run. The laughter followed me all the way back to the truck, echoing off the trees and seeming to come from every direction at once. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned it down the mountain road without looking back. But I could feel something watching me go, something that was in no hurry to follow because it knew where I lived. The drive home took 6 hours, and I spent every minute checking my mirrors, not for headlights or other cars, but for shadows that moved wrong, for shapes that didn't belong. The radio kept cutting to static whenever I tried to find a station, so I drove in silence while my mind raced through everything Dad had tried to teach me. He'd said the barriers would hold as long as nobody moved the stones. But what happened when the person who built them died? What happened when the knowledge of how to maintain them was buried with the only person who understood them? I'd killed my father. Not directly, but the stress of what happened at the cabin, the supernatural encounter, the knowledge that his daughter had unleashed something evil. It had all been too much for his heart, and when he died, whatever spiritual protection he'd woven around that circle had died with him. The thing was free now, free and angry and looking for the person who'd trapped it in the first place. I got home after midnight and triple-checked every lock on my apartment. I pulled all the curtains closed and turned on every light. I even dragged my dresser in front of the bedroom door before trying to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those stone fragments scattered in the black earth. I heard that satisfied laughter echoing through the trees. I smelled rotten flowers and fresh graves. Around 3 a.m., I heard soft crying outside my window.